Hey folks, welcome to week 4. We're going to go over one of the quiz questions from last week's quiz. There's some clarification I wanted to make on that. And then we'll take a look at this week's grammar lesson, lesson 20 in Futato, and just kind of work through some of the infinitive forms and how they work. So hopefully that'll be helpful for you. Not much in the way of announcements this week, so we can dive a little bit more into the grammar. To start off, I'm going to pull this quiz question up here. This was one of the translations. Now, not everybody would have received this translation question on your quiz. The quizzes actually pull, I think in this last quiz, it pulled 2 sentences from a pool of like 7. And so some of you would have gotten some sentences that other people didn't see. This was one of the questions in the pool, and not everybody got this one, but I wanted to provide a clarification on the suffixes and how they relate to the word of for father. So here, since I've got the opportunity, I might as well just work through this sentence here. We start off in a Hebrew sentence. I'm going to expect, not demand, but I'm going to anticipate that the first word of the sentence is going to be either some sort of temporal phrase setting the scene for the sentence, or it's just going to be the main verb. Hebrew word order, you tend to, especially in narrative, I should say, you tend to start with the main verb, and then if there's an explicit subject, you'll see that. So here we have telech. Now, telech has 3 letters, which I would expect a Hebrew verbal root to have. The problem is the vowel pattern here tells me this cannot be the Cal Perfect 3MS form. If this were Cal Perfect 3MS of talach, I would have kametz patak. So I know something weird is happening here, something strange. Well, again, you want to remember that sere pattern that we've talked about for the 1 yod vav verbs. The 1 yod vavs in the imperfect, the Cal imperfect, are going to produce this sere pattern where the prefix vowel becomes a sere and we're going to call this the R2 vowel, just because, even though we're missing the first root letter, it's probably most accurate to just call it the second root letter vowel, or the R2 vowel. So when I see this sere pattern, I'm immediately thinking this might be a Cal imperfect form of a 1 yod vav weak verb. If that's the case, I know I can take off the first letter because that's going to be the prefix, and then I can add a yod to the front. And so that yod is going to give me yalach. And you'll remember that whenever you get to parsing and you get to rebuilding your root, and you get to the Hebrew verb yalach, you're going to know that this is halach, because yalach is not a Hebrew verb that we're learning. So whenever you see yalach, think halach. So halach here in the Cal Perfect 3MS would mean he went. So here we have to figure out what the parsing is so we know how to appropriately translate it. We know it's Cal imperfect, so we're going to default to the future tense for Cal imperfect, even though it doesn't always have to be translated that way. And then we have to figure out the person number conjugation here. So the tav at the beginning, the tav prefix, that occurs in 4 conjugations. Nope, that occurs in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I think 6. Doesn't matter how many there are. This can either be third feminine or this can be second person. If it has no suffix at all, it has to be singular. And if it were second person feminine, it would have a hierik yod suffix. So the tav prefix with no suffix is going to tell me either third feminine singular of the Cal imperfect or second masculine singular of the Cal imperfect. Now we'll hold off judgment. We don't know what that is yet, but we've at least parsed it. And we know that this is going to mean someone will go. All right, so now we can move on to the next. And again, in the third person, if this were third person, I would be on the lookout for an explicit subject noun here, because if you have a third person verb, it doesn't have to have a subject, an explicit subject noun, but second person and first person are rarely going to have subject nouns, and if they do, they're going to be the pronouns. So this is a situation where it could be third person, so I'm just going to keep my eye out and see if I can run into a subject, which would usually be the very next word. Now, the very next word begins with a bait, and I see a shava under it. I immediately start thinking preposition. It doesn't have to be the preposition bait. There are other Hebrew words that begin with a beit shava, but when I see that, I'm thinking this might be the preposition beit. So if I take that off and I look at the rest of the word, I see derech. And derech is a word that I've learned. This is the word for way or path, something like that. So because I've got a preposition on this noun, it's probably not my subject, which telech could still be third person, but this just makes it more likely, I guess, or it confirms that second person masculine singular is a real possibility here. So if I've got beit preposition plus derech, then I notice that my makef here is telling me that derech is in construct. There's really no way to know just from the spelling of derech that it's in construct here, because it looks the same whether it's construct or absolute. Most seglet nouns do. But when we see the makef and we notice that it's right next to another noun, well, usually when you have 2 consecutive nouns in Hebrew without a conjunction, there's a good reason to think that might be a there's a good reason to think that that might be a construct chain, especially if the second noun or last noun in that group has the definite article, but the others in that chain do not. Okay, those are telltale signs that you're probably looking at a construct chain. So if I wanted to translate bederich, I know that I have bait, which can mean in, at, with, it can mean a lot of things, and then derich would be way. So I could say in a way, on a way, at a path, something like that. But do I know that derech is indefinite? Like, I'm translating it indefinitely because I don't see a definite article here. But remember, the construct noun will not have a definite article. The definiteness of a construct noun depends on the definiteness of its absolute. And so I have to go to the end of the construct chain, which I have because the next word here, assure, this is no longer a noun, so that breaks the construct chain. And I have to check the definiteness of the final word in the construct chain, which is haberit. Haberit does have an article, so it is definite, therefore derech is definite. So this would be in the way of. Again, not all constructs are going to be possession, but when I put that of gloss after the noun, the construct noun, that helps me pick up on the fact that we've got a construct relationship here. So if you see a noun in construct, it's a good habit in your gloss stage, in your analysis stage, to just put an of after it to remind yourself that this is going to be a construct. All right, so in the way of what? In the way of habrit, the. If I take off the hepatok dagesh, I'm left with brit, which is the word for covenant. In the way of the covenant, and then I get asher. So asher here, being a relative pronoun, asher is going to begin a new clause. So I can kind of draw a line in the sentence right here, breaking it off as this is sort of the main clause, and then here I get a relative clause, which is going to, it's going to support what comes before, but this can kind of stand on its own. So now I'm going to break this off into sort of its own little section to translate because it is a clause itself. And so assure, again, this could mean who, which, that, whose, whom. It can mean a lot of different things. I usually just put which in there as a placeholder because I feel like that's the most general of the relative pronouns. It's the most flexible maybe. So I'll just say which. Okay, so in the way of the covenant, which, and now we've got a verb here. Now, this may not look like a verb to you because it's very weak, but what we've actually got here is, and again, maybe it's good to talk about this. When you get to a new clause, just like our main clause, we expect the main verb to be at the beginning. In our relative clause, we would expect this supporting verb or this dependent verb to be toward the beginning of that clause as well. And then any subject of that verb, if there is an explicit subject, we would expect that to follow verb. Again, this is just basic general Hebrew word order in narrative. It doesn't always have to be this way, but the more you kind of walk through this process, the more you'll start to just sort of anticipate the verb toward the beginning of the clause, followed by any subject and then objects and so forth. So here I've got my relative pronoun which, and then I've got yitain. Now if you don't immediately recognize yitain, I'll just tell you it is a verb. And so you might think, okay, well, how many letters is a Hebrew verbal root supposed to have? It's supposed to have 3. This has 3. Okay, maybe this is my root. Except if my root is yod, tav, nun, then, and it was in the CalPerfect 3MS, which is so far the only conjugation we've learned that can have the 3 root letters, then I would expect a kametz patach here, and that's not what I have. So this can't be CalPerfect 3MS. Well, if it's not CalPerfect 3MS, then we've probably gotten into a situation where we have lost one of the original root letters, and then some other letter has been added, either a prefix or a suffix or something like that. So if I look at the vowel pattern, that's a good place to go next to see if there's sort of a reliable, predictable vowel pattern. And I get hirik tsere. Hirik tsere is not one of these predictable, reliable, regular vowel patterns. But if, well, before we jump to just, let's pretend we know very little about this. Let's just think to ourselves, where do letters go missing in verbs? So we could lose a letter at the end of the verb and then have something added back on at the beginning or the end. We could lose one at the beginning of a word and have something added back on at the beginning or the end. Maybe it's best to think about what would be our extra letter here. So what could be added? Do we ever add a yod to the beginning of a verb? Well, we know that when we add something to the beginning, it tends to be in the imperfect, and we'll just call this the imperfect family of verbs. So within the imperfect family, you've got the imperfect conjugation, which is sort of the main imperfect form, but there are a lot of other forms that are closely related to the imperfect that we'll learn. In the other end, you've got the perfect family. Okay, and so in the perfect family, you tend to have suffixes. So the imperfect family, you tend to have prefixes. The perfect family, you tend to have suffixes. And the imperfect family also has suffixes most of the time, but you get the idea here. If we've got a prefix, it's probably imperfect. And we can confirm that by the hirik prefix vowel, because usually in the Cal imperfect, when we have a prefix, the prefix letter, except for the aleph, is going to be a hirik. All right? So then we'll notice that we've got a dagesh in the next letter. Well, when we see a dagesh in the next letter, there's a couple possibilities here. One, you see a dagesh and it's in a begad kafat letter. So there's a chance it could be a weak dagesh or a strong dagesh. Which one is it? Well, if we know our dagesh rules, then we'll know that this letter holding the dagesh is preceded by a vowel sound, not a consonant sound. And so since it's preceded by a vowel sound, this makes this a strong dagesh. This is the doubling dagesh. Well, the only time we've seen so far where we add a doubling dagesh in a verb is when the one noon assimilates into the second root letter. And so if we pull a noon back out here, we get natan, and that would be a verb that we've learned. That would be the verb he gave. So if natan is he gave, then yitain is going to be he will give, or simply will give, if we have an explicit subject that tells us who the he is. So this would be will give, which someone will give. Okay? Since it's third person here, we can go looking for an explicit subject noun. Okay, so the next word would fill that role usually. So let's see if that works. It needs to be a masculine singular noun. Well, the problem is it's got a hirik yod mem suffix, but the word Elohim, even though it has that hirik yod mem suffix, it will take a singular verb most of the time. So that's not a disagreement here. I know that morphologically the form looks like a disagreement, but the sense of Elohim, this does match the singular. And it is masculine, so this would be a candidate for the subject of yitain. So then we could say, God will give, which God will give. But we've still got more. So what is the last word here? Well, the first thing I see is a lamed shavah at the beginning. Now, there are a lot of Hebrew words that begin with lamed shavah that don't necessarily have the preposition. You know, this isn't necessarily the preposition, but when I see lamed shavah at the beginning of a Hebrew word, I'm thinking maybe that is the preposition lamed. So if I take that off, do I have something I recognize? I have avicha. And avicha itself is not a word that I recognize, but I do recognize av. If I recognize av, I ask myself, is there a way for me to explain the icha? And this is where some students got a little bit confused because they see the cha 2ms suffix for possession, and they see a yod, which makes you think, okay, then the noun must be plural. And so they would translate this, to fathers of you, or to your fathers. The problem is, avicha is not your fathers. Avicha is your father. The problem is that yod there, because we've kind of learned that if the noun is plural, it's going to have a yod. But remember, some singular nouns, sometimes you will see a singular noun with a pronoun suffix that has a yod as well. The example that we always see is the 1cs suffix e. We see that 1cs e suffix. That's not exactly what we're looking at here. But just because, take the word susi, just because susi has the yod in the suffix, that doesn't mean that sus is plural. That is one form. That 1cs form has a yod, but it is singular. If it were plural, it would be susai, with the patach yod. So the yod in the suffix doesn't guarantee, and I'm being a little bit loose when I say in the suffix, but the yod between the noun and the suffix does not guarantee that the noun is plural. But if the noun is plural, it is necessary. It is, you might call it a necessary but not sufficient condition to indicate a plural noun. Okay, so basically I've told you that av is singular. But why is the yod there then? I mean, if it's not indicating that av is plural, why is it there? Well, when you learn, let me see if he goes over this. I think that Futato did this in the possessive suffixes on singular nouns. So there are these little boxes that are not as graphically appealing as some of the charts, and they're easy to skip over. But if you scroll down here in this lesson, this is lesson 16. Okay, actually this is a chart, so this should stick out. Nouns with odd forms in the construct with possessive suffixes. So av, when it takes a suffix, any noun when it takes a suffix, it is by default construct, because it's in construct with the suffix. And av, when it goes in construct, this is the form that it takes, avi, okay? So avi is the construct form, and then when you add the cha suffix, this reduced vowel comes back out as the kametz, and you just get cha. But that avi is the noun itself. The e part is not part of the suffix. So when we look at this word here, the e is not part of the suffix. This is part of the word. Avi is the word, and cha is the suffix. Cha is the suffix that we get for 2ms on a singular noun. So just so you're aware, just so you know what to make of this moving forward, if of were plural here, if this were your father's, how would it look? It would look like this. You would have the plural form of the noun, avot. Now, I think that the ending here would be the segel. It might be the sere, but I think it's the segel. Avotecha. Avotecha would be your father's, but it would have that plural form of av in there, okay? Now, this is kind of a unique word anyways, because av as a masculine noun is taking the whole involved top suffix, which you're not used to seeing, but that really saves you here. If you don't see avot, you know that it's going to be father, not fathers. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. If we put it all together now, we get you will, most likely. It could be he will, it could be she will. But most likely this is you. And again, let me explain why I say most likely. One, there's two reasons. One, the 2ms form is much more common than the 3fs form. Even though they're identical, usually it's going to be the 2ms form. As we look through here, again, it's possible that this second person pronoun is unrelated grammatically to the main verb, but as we translate through, we'll see that actually the sentence doesn't make sense to have this 2ms suffix if this is a third feminine singular. So we're going to go with the 2ms, you will go, or you will walk, bederech habrit, in the way, remember this is definite because this is definite, in the way of the covenant which, or the covenant that, someone, namely Elohim le'avicha, God, this is not part of God's name. Elohim, which someone, namely Elohim, which Elohim will give to your father. So here, you will walk in the way of the covenant which Elohim God will give to your father. That's the correct translation there. So another thing I want to point out as well, sometimes I went looking for this in Futato, and I'm not sure where he introduces it. I didn't see it as I was looking through. But when you see this word, Yod He Vav He, if you didn't know, this is the divine name. You can translate it a few different ways. I don't want you to translate it as Jehovah. Jehovah is not, first of all, it's not I shouldn't say it's not a translation. There are problems with Jehovah. We'll leave it at that. I want to open a new can of worms. Jehovah is a misunderstanding of this word. This word, if it were just transliterated into English letters, would be YHWH, or YHVH if you prefer. But what I want you to consider as translation possibilities is you can either translate this as Yahweh if you prefer, just YAHWEH. You can translate it as just YHWH if you like, or you can translate it as the Lord, or you can translate it as Adonai. Any of those are fine with me. Those are all conventional ways of translating it. But I need you to realize that this is a name. This is not just any noun. This is a proper noun. It's a personal name. And so, as such, it will always be definite. So if something is in construct with this word will not have a definite article because it's a name, and Hebrew doesn't usually put definite articles on names, but it's still definite. That's important to realize. All right, so that's just an aside that I also wanted to point out to you. Hopefully that makes sense here. Again, the real thing I wanted to tackle is why avicha is not fathers. If it were fathers, it would be avotecha. If you have questions about that, please let me know. All right, so let's take a look at this week's lesson. Looking at infinitives now, we'll go to lesson 20 here. Infinitives are good news and bad news. The good news is they are very simple in their form. For example, if you go to the Cal perfect and imperfect, look at this paradigm. The Cal perfect has 9 different conjugations. I know there's 10 words here, but these two are identical. 9 different conjugations. The imperfect probably has 9 too, because these are also identical. And then these are identical, so this really only has 8 different forms. But that's 9 forms and 8 forms, and really you're writing out 10 and 10. That's a lot of forms for a conjugation. Here's the good news. The infinitives in the Cal, those are your forms. Infinitive construct, infinitive absolute. Now, if you've read the lesson, you're going to know that, well, it's not quite that simple. We put prepositions on the infinitive, we put suffixes on the infinitive, and that's true. But the verb form itself, the part of the verb, this is what it looks like, okay? Now, it does change depending on the suffixes that you add, but I got bad news for you. These do too. When we get to adding object suffixes to perfect and imperfect verbs, it's going to affect the spelling as well. So just get ready. My point is the infinitives, as far as the form goes, the spelling, how the words are built, very, very simple. So that's the good news. If you want to think of bad news here, the bad news is it's a little tricky to get your head around how the infinitive functions in Hebrew. Kind of the basic way to understand the infinitive is to just look at what the infinitive is in English. And in English, infinitives are basically a verb with the preposition to in front of it. So if you were to say speak, the infinitive form of speak in English would be to speak. If you were to say run, it would be to run. If it were, know, it would be to know. Hebrew and English have a lot of similarities in how the infinitive functions, but there are also some differences, and that's where it can get a little bit tricky. So there's nothing here that is confusing, I don't think. It's just you have to get used to the fact that Hebrew may do something with an infinitive where we would use a different form in English to communicate that. Hebrew, you're not always going to be able to just translate a Hebrew infinitive as to verb, okay? That's the part that can get a little bit tricky. Again, it's not super confusing, it's just different. So let's look at the infinitive section here. So let's talk about what an infinitive is. An infinitive is basically a verbal noun. It is a noun in its function, but it has a verbal idea behind it, okay? And so just like a verb, infinitives will have patterns. They have the cal infinitive, and we will learn about the pl infinitive and the hifil infinitive and the nifal infinitive. They have patterns just like verbs do, and they have a verbal root. So the root letters of the infinitive are going to be based on the verb roots that you've learned in your vocabulary. So halach would be a verbal root. That's a bad one because it's weak. So just katal. Katal is he killed. Katol would be to kill in Hebrew. And so it's still based on that triconsonantal root, just like a verb would be. Most students probably just think of infinitives in Hebrew as verbs. They are a type of verb. They function like a noun functions in a lot of ways, but you can think of them just as verbs because they're so connected to what verbs are. But just like a noun, infinitives can have prepositions attached to them. They have state, so you'll see we looked at the infinitive. So the infinitives can be in the construct, they can be absolute, all right? And we'll talk a little bit about the differences between these. You can kind of see that the infinitive construct and the infinitive absolute, if you look at the absolute, it's kind of a bulkier form, and that's what we see with nouns that are in construct versus absolute as well. The absolute form is sort of the bulkier form, whereas the construct is more of the constricted form. It's kind of shortened. It's the vowels are shortened. That's what happens here. You take the kametz vowel and you reduce it to a shavah. You again, this doesn't really affect the length, but it's less bulk. The absolute will often have the holum vav, whereas the construct is just the holum. So that's kind of a good way to keep them separated in your mind. Now, the infinitive absolute will never have a suffix. The infinitive absolute will not have a preposition. Okay, it'll always stand on its own. So if you're looking at an infinitive just by itself, a good clue is this kametz. If you see a kametz inside of an infinitive, the R1 letter, that's almost that. If it's an infinitive, it's an infinitive absolute. So, but this shavah holum pattern, this is going to be a pretty recognizable pattern. You'll see if we look at infinitives, infinitive constructs, you'll see all the way down here we've got shavah holum. This one isn't a shavah, but it's a reduced, so hatef patach holum. Here we've got a segel tav pattern, which we'll talk about. That's a particular weak verb. But again, here we've got shavah holum. Now here, this is a holum vav. Don't get this confused with the absolute, because this isn't just holum vav, this is holum vav tav. This is the verb galah. And we saw that third hay verbs, in the perfect conjugation, they end with kametz hay. Third hay verbs in the imperfect conjugation, when there's no suffix, end with segel hay. Yevneh for bana. This would be yigleh for galah. So the imperfect ends with segel hay. The infinitive construct, these are going to end with holum vav tav. So galah becomes glot. So glot here, this is the holum vav tav ending of a third hay infinitive construct. But again, you get shavah holum. I already talked about the segel tav pattern, which I'm going to keep repeating here because you need to. This is basically the infinitive version of the sere pattern that we saw in the infinitive, or I'm sorry, the count imperfect one yod vavs. Number 7 here, we've got Yahweh holum. Now you'll see a patach here. You see a patach up here. These third gutturals will often sneak a sneaky or a furtive patach in there just because they really prefer to have A-class vowels, but you still get Yahweh holum. All right, so Yahweh holum. Here we have patach pattern, which is I should say patach tav, but we saw this in the one yod vavs as well in the imperfect, where you usually have sere. For example, yada, you would have patach instead of sere. And so here, instead of segel tav, you get patach tav. Again, benot, this would again be a third hey. So again, benot, this would be a third hey. So you've got the Yahweh holum vav tav, and baka would also be a third hey. But you see here, the Yahweh pretty much all the way down is what you expect to see in the first root letter. So the infinitive, what else? Just like a noun can have possessive suffixes, an infinitive construct, anyways, can have pronoun suffixes as well. They don't indicate possession. Instead, they indicate either the subject or the object of the verbal root that the infinitive is built on. So that's something to keep in mind as well. All right. Forming the infinitive. This is the good news, okay? If you were to think of building verbs in Hebrew like making a recipe, this would basically be your recipe, okay? So how to make a kal infinitive construct verb in Hebrew. Step 1. Take a kal imperfect 3ms version of that verb. All right, so for katal, here we've got yiktol. So take a kal imperfect 3ms version. That's step 1. Step 2, pull off the prefix. And that's it. You're done. Pull off the prefix of a kal imperfect 3ms verb, and you have the kal infinitive for the strong verbs. We'll talk about the weak verbs in a minute. So if we've got yiktol, so what is the prefix here? Well, the prefix, yod is the prefix letter, Hirik is the prefix vowel. So if we pull these off, we get kof shava, tet, holum lamed. Kof shava, tet, holum lamed. That's all the infinitive construct form is. Okay, in the strong verbs, without prefixes or suffixes, all you have to do to get that root infinitive construct form of a strong verb is take the imperfect 3ms form and take off the prefix letter, prefix vowel. You're gonna keep the shava, you're gonna keep the holum. If the kal imperfect 3ms version has a holum theme vowel. There are some imperfect verbs that we saw that instead of a holum, some of the stative verbs, instead of a holum, they have a patach. Well, if that's the case, then you'll have a patach in the R2 vowel here as well. But that's literally what it is. Whatever the form of the imperfect is, just take off the prefix and you've got the infinitive construct. It's that easy. So now, if you want to add those suffixes, which we've learned about suffixes that are... there's one group of suffixes that you will add to singular nouns, and there's one group of suffixes that you will add to plural nouns. But we talked about how the shortcut there is to look at the group for singular nouns and look at the group for plural nouns and figure out what is the same between each one. So for example, the 3ms form. For singular nouns, you use holum vav. For plural nouns, you use kametz yod vav, but you use vav in both. So vav should sort of trigger for you a 3ms suffix idea. All right, and so again, when you see your infinitive construct with a vav on the end, that should get you thinking 3ms suffix, okay? Of course, whenever you add vowels to the end of a word, it's going to change the syllables a little bit, which means the spelling's going to change a little bit, all right? And so what happens here is he walks us through this process. All right, so here we've got the verbal root katal, or, that's how you would say it in the CalPerfect 3ms. We've got kof, tet, lamed here. Okay, so if we wanted to make an infinitive, what we would do is we would take the imperfect form, which is yiktol. So we got yiktol, and we would just remove the prefix. We get katol. Now, if we want to add a suffix here, like let's say the 3ms suffix, well, we have katol, and then it would be holum vav. Let me write it like this, holum vav, okay? Now, this is going to cause the vowels to shift a little bit here. And the vowel pattern in the infinitive construct is that this holum, this O-class vowel in R2, this is going to not reduce, this is going to break the syllable. You're going to get one syllable here and one syllable here. Well, you can't do that with a holum, so you can only break a syllable with a silent shava. So that holum is now a silent Yahweh, and the O class, this is just how I think about it to remember, okay? This is not necessarily morphologically what happens, but this helps me remember what's going on. I imagine that O class vowel, it can't be here anymore, so it's just going to jump back here as a kametz chatuf, okay? This is the form you're going to see. The kametz chatuf still represents the O class of the infinitive. Now, it can't be a holum, because if it were a holum, this would be a vocal Yahweh, all right? This has to be a silent Yahweh here. So that means that this is the short O, not the holum O class. So we'll get kot lu here. This is not a kametz, this is not A class, this is O class, this is a kametz chatuf. All right, so we get kot lu. If we wanted and so how would we translate this? Well, it's a little bit tricky because in English we use different words if the 3ms is the subject or the object. So this would basically be to kill and then 3ms. So this could be to kill he, which would be he to kill, which would be him, he doing killing. Or this could be to kill him, which would be the object. So it is a little bit ambiguous whether the suffix is representing the subject or the object of the verbal idea. Context will have to determine that. But it could be either, okay? And so what you're going to do as you go through these is you're going to remember, you're not going to just jump to holum vav, that must be him, okay? Because it might be he. This is very important to remember because this is not the way that infinitives work in English. We don't use infinitives usually to, we don't build clauses around infinitives. So that's why this gets a little bit tricky. But again, if you wanted to do 1CS, you could do kot li. Kot li would be to kill I to kill, or it could be to kill me, killing me. All right, so that's what you have to keep in mind. All right, so now let's look at how different weak verbs are affected by the infinitive form. So here we've got the one gutturals. One gutturals are going to be affected because usually the first root letter of an infinitive construct is Yahweh. It's a vocal Yahweh usually, but gutturals don't like Yahwehs. They try to resist them, avoid them. And so what you get here is instead of Ahmad having a Yahweh holum, you get Ahmad having a hatef patach. Because again, the ayin is going to prefer an A class anyways, but because it doesn't want a Yahweh, it gets the hatef vowel, and then you get the holum. Now, when you add the suffix, it looks normal again because it's no longer a Yahweh. It's just that kametz chatuf with the 3ms suffix, okay? But that's the irregularity with the one guttural, is it won't take a Yahweh here, so you're going to expect a hatef vowel. Usually that's going to be, I think almost always it's going to be hatef patach or hatef segel. Usually it will be hatef patach. All right, so then Shema, here we've got a 3 guttural. That means that the guttural is on the 3rd root letter, and this is that situation where it tries to sneak in a patach. All right, so everything looks normal, shmoa, except for that at the end here. So that's just the irregularity that you get used to. This is not going to prevent you from identifying this as an infinitive construct. It has the Yahweh under R1, it has the holum in R2. You're good. It just has an extra patach here because the ayin and the chet in particular like to have that A class vowel to kind of slide into the guttural. All right, one yod vav. This is the one that has a very predictable pattern that you just need to memorize. Just like the one yod vav in the imperfect had the sere sere pattern, or sometimes patach patach pattern, here it gets a segel segel tav pattern. All right, and so anytime you see segel segel tav in a 3 root letter word, I shouldn't say 3 root letter because the tav is not part of the root. What happens here is your one yod drops off like it normally does for a one yod vav, and to compensate, the tav is added to the end. But the segel segel tav is that pattern that you're going to keep an eye out for. And when you see that, you can just take off the segel segel tav, put a yod back at the beginning, and that should give you your verbal root. All right, so yashav becomes shevet. And I should let you know that in these segel segel tav infinitives, the first syllable is always accented. So this is not shevet, this is shevet. Now, when you go and you add the suffix to this, what's going to happen is where you usually would have a holum going down to a Yahweh, just like up here. Where are we at? Just like up here, holum. I wish this were. Where you normally have a holum right here going down to a Yahweh. Same thing. It's not a holum in shevet, but the segel goes to a shava, so that's normal. But instead of, because this is an E class, E and I class are closely related, what happens here is this first segel turns into a hirik, okay? So you get Futato. Now, the reason why you've got a dagesh here is this is not a strong dagesh. This is not doubling anything. It's just that the letter that contains the dagesh, it is immediately preceded by the consonantal sound of the bait. So that makes this a silent shava, which means this has to be the weak dagesh. Okay, this dagesh is only here because it's a begad kafat letter preceded by a consonantal sound. All right, so don't get confused by the dagesh there. All right, one yod vav, segel tav pattern. When you add a suffix, the first segel goes to hirik. Pretty straightforward there. All right, one noons. These are different than what you're used to with a one noon. With a one noon, you're used to assimilation. But what happens here is this can take a couple different forms. I think that usually, most often, what you are going to run into is just this situation where the reason why it's strange is because the whole point of how we get to the infinitive was to take the imperfect and then remove the prefix. Well, in a one noon imperfect, the noon gets assimilated, and so you don't. Why do you get it back if that's not the imperfect form? It's not the imperfect form minus the prefix. The noon wasn't here anyways. But what's going on? Let's just write this out over here. So we have the verb noon pe lamed, which in the imperfect 3ms, cal imperfect 3ms, would be ye. That noon would assimilate into the pe. You get yipol. Okay, that's the form that you would get for the. Get rid of that. That's the form you would get in the imperfect. And so you might think, okay, so you just take off the prefix. That leaves you with pol. Well, now that you've taken the prefix off, the noon is no longer squished, okay? It now has, the bully's gone away, it can now come out from hiding. And so in that situation, the one noon with the infinitive construct, because you no longer have a prefix there, that noon doesn't need to assimilate anymore. And so you get the noon, shava, pe, holam, lamed, nafol, okay? So this one isn't really irregular. It's just we built this whole infinitive thing based on the imperfect, and this is very different from the imperfect. But if you think of it as shava holam, your vowel pattern, it's exactly what you would expect. All right. Now, some of the one noons are actually going to conjugate similar to a one yod vav, so just be aware of that. There are some, Nagash is one of them, where it's going to go geshet. The noon is going to drop off. You're going to get the segel tav pattern. And in this case, again, I'm sorry, make a chart if you need to. In this case, you don't get the hirik in R1 when you add the suffix, you get a patach. That's irregular, but hey, it's weak verbs. This is what happens, okay? And then finally, like I said, third hey, basically, if you've got a third hey verb in the cal perfect, that's going to be a kametz hey, okay? If there's no suffix, it's going to be kametz hey. In the cal imperfect, if you've got a third hey verb, that's going to be segel hey, so this would be gileh. But when you get to the infinitive construct, this hey is going to transform into a holam vav tav, and that's where you get galot, all right? And then here, fortunately, because of this form, when you add a suffix, it really doesn't change the spelling at all. You still get galot because this holam vav is unchangeably long. It can't shift. It's staying there. And that's why it makes it easy to recognize with the suffixes on there. Okay, now here's another one of these wonderful boxes where it's not very visually appealing, but this is important information. Those are some other irregular verbs that you want to be aware of. So yatsa, that has what we call a quiescent aleph at the end. The aleph is closing that syllable. That's why in the cal perfect this is not a patach, because this syllable isn't closed, so Hebrew wants a long vowel here, and so the patach lengthens to the kametz. Well, in this case, you get, instead of a shava with the aleph having its own vowel, what you get here instead is you get the sere as the long vowel, and again the aleph can't close that, so it needs a consonant to close that. You get say to, and this to here doesn't actually close, it just begins the new syllable. But the quiescent aleph can't take a suffix on its own because it's quiescent. It's almost like it's not even there, so it needs this tav to stand in to take on that suffix. So just an irregularity, just be aware of it. If you see this, you're probably going, if you see Sade Aleph at the beginning of a word, it's a good bet that you're looking at Yetzah in some form. All right, remember halach follows the one yod vav pattern, so it's going to be leket instead of heloch. It's going to be leket, that segel tav pattern. And then with the suffix, again, another irregularity here. Here's one where the first vowel, instead of hirik and instead of patach, like nagash, this now becomes, or this I guess just remains as segel, so this would be lekto. All right, and then natan, this is just completely irregular. It basically becomes tate. And when you add the suffixes on there, that's going to cause this syllable to shorten to a hirik, and so you're going to get tito or tt or something like that. And then also keep in mind that lakach, that follows the one noon paradigm. I'm not sure why he says it follows the one noon paradigm here, because it really only does that in the Cal Imperfect. In the infinitive, lakach really follows the one yod vav pattern. Not segel tav, because you've got the chet here. It's patak tav, but it's really following the one yod vav pattern. So, anyways. All right, this section here just shows you some different ways that the infinitive construct gets used in Hebrew. Some of these are similar to English, some of them aren't, so just be aware of these. They will often be related to prepositions. So here, when it has the lamed preposition, it can function as a verbal complement. So a verb like yakol, to be able, well, you usually think to be able to do something. That's called a verbal complement. It's complementing the verb of able with judge, so he's able to judge. You'll usually see a lamed on prepositions when it has that usage. It can also indicate purpose, so the reason or the purpose why the main verb happened. He sat down, yashav, he sat down. Why did he sit down? To read, likro, okay? And then if you want to negate the infinitive construct, we had this word in our vocabulary last week because we're introducing it this week, but bilti, this is the negative particle here that's used for infinitives, all right? So it often will have the lamed in front of it, but this would basically, this is where his translation so as not comes from, but this is lest something happen. So you could translate this as so as not to reign over the city, or you could translate it as lest he reign over the city. You know, that's kind of how lest versus so as not works, okay? But those are common uses of the infinitive construct with the lamed preposition. Other uses, one with the bait, this would be a temporal use. So you often see this at the beginning of a sentence. Similarly here, when you see beyom, the preposition bait with yom and then the infinitive, this would be something like in the day to reign the king would mean in the day of the king's reigning, or in the day when the king reigned. And you wouldn't even necessarily need to translate bayom. This is a convention in Hebrew that doesn't, I mean, I would say for this class, keep it in, but as you develop in your translation, you may not use it because it has this, it's a convention in Hebrew that is not as common in English. All right, we talked a little bit about the infinitive absolute in the form here. So it's just kind of a less constricted infinitive. Let's talk about how the infinitive absolute gets used. Here you've got one example of an irregular infinitive absolute. I think that usually what you're going to see here is that the infinitive absolute, no matter what the type of verb is, it may just be that certain weak verbs don't appear in the infinitive absolute. The infinitive absolute is much rarer than the infinitive construct, but one place where you need to be aware of an irregularity is the third hey. Often that hey will drop off and you'll just have a holum there, or it could be that you've got the kamets in R1 and then you've got the holum without a vav, and then you've got the hey. So just be aware of that. If you see holum hey on a third hey verb, it's probably the infinitive absolute is the idea here. All right, so functions, different uses of the infinitive absolute. He only covers emphasis. It's a little broader than this, but this is enough to get you started. If you just translate your infinitive absolutes this way throughout this course, you'll be on track. If you take Hebrew 2, or I should say intermediate Hebrew, you might learn some more nuance to the infinitive absolute. But just think of the infinitive absolute as a way of intensifying the verbal idea of whatever verb it's with. So sometimes the infinitive absolute will be placed with an infinitive construct, and it will serve to intensify the verbal action of the infinitive construct, in which case the infinitive absolute is going to be the same root as whatever it's with. So here you get shamor, tishmor. This is with the imperfect. So this would mean you will certainly guard, okay? Shamor, tishmor. You could translate this, to guard you will guard, but that doesn't make any sense in English. The idea here is that shamor intensifies tishmor. So don't translate this, to guard you will guard, or guarding you will guard. Translate this, you will certainly guard, you will surely guard, something like that, intensifying. Then we've got naton, yitnu. Yitnu here is going to be they will give. Naton is going to be that intensification. So they will certainly give, they will surely give, something like that. And then you've got Yashov intensifying Neshev. So here, Yashov would be sort of like, don't think that Yashov means certainly. It doesn't mean certainly, but this is how we would kind of emphasize this in English. So Yashov Neshev would be, we will certainly dwell, or we will surely dwell. All right, well, hopefully that's helpful. If you have any questions, please let me know. I want to make sure that I prioritize those for the conference this week. That will be scheduled in the announcement itself. Hope you have a great day.